Hello and welcome to the Wednesday, March 14th Cluster API meeting sponsored by SIG Cluster Lifecycle. So first on the agenda today, I wanted to bring up the name of the new repository that we had set up. We had a few people comment on the name, and in general, naming with the new repository naming structure has been a bit controversial. So right now we are github.com/kubernetes-sigs/clif_cluster-API. A lot of weird delimiters and a lot of weird acronyms. Does anybody have any thoughts on that or want to suggest a different name? The reason for the clif prefix is to denote that it's a SIG cluster lifecycle project. Instead of doing sig-cluster-lifecycle_cluster-nova or cluster-API, we just went with clif. It was a little bit shorter. Cool. I think that is relatively easy to change at this point. If anybody does want to bring something else up, once we start vendoring that code, changing the repository name will be a little bit trickier. Looks like Jason had a comment. Jason, I'd like it if we could get rid of the prefixes in favor of tags, but I'm not willing to fight for that battle myself. I agree. I think the repository name should be descriptive of what the repository is and not used as a way to denote what the repository represents or who owns it, but we get what we can get. It's not impossible to change repository names. We just switched Kubicorn over. GitHub will automatically do the HTTP redirect within reason. And it's pretty easy to do a grep through your code and do like a sed replacement for import paths. Not impossible, but just introduces more work and potential bottlenecks later. Okay. So yeah, if anybody comes up with anything else, feel free to bring it up. I think the other thing for the repository is we need to figure out what we want to track there. We had talked a little bit about moving the API there. Is that still something we want to focus on? And do we want to assign an owner for that work? I'm going to take that silence as we should bring this up at a later time. Okay.
So Chris, I'm sorry, I joined a little late, so I'm just catching up. This is just for the kind of like we do kubeadm for a repository for tracking bugs and whatnot?
We had asked for a new repository. We talked about separating the API away from implementation. And the original reason we put the API work in kubedeploy anyway was because the repository process was frozen while the steering committee had figured out the new process. Now that we have a new process, we were able to get a new repository. And this is kind of an open discussion about what we want to do with that and how we want to start tracking work there, if at all.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. My idea here, if I had to pick something just to get the conversation started, and again, we talked about this a little bit last week, moving the API code only, which would be the API definition and any of the aggregated API infrastructure underneath that into the new repository and keeping implementation either in kubedeploy or wherever it may be. Another problem that we're going to run into is if we want to move issues. I know we put a lot of work into defining milestones in the kubedeploy repository. Migrating those might also be a chore as well, which is why I think it might be helpful to have somebody own this, but still begs the question of, do we even want to go through this whole process in general? I am fine with coming up with a proposal for migrating issues and defining the scope of what should be in the new repo and pull requesting that to the new repository to get this thing started. think that sounds like a good starting point.
Consensus on what should be transferred, or is that what needs to be discussed?
I would like to have a discussion on what needs to be transferred. And as a starting point, I was just going to write a proposal to define the scope of where those boundaries are on what should and shouldn't be transferred.
Okay, and you're going to file that in the existing kube deploy repo?
I can file it in either if we have strong opinions either way.
Sorry, I kind of joined late. Where's the destination for this? Has that been decided?
The destination for the proposal or for the code in general?
The proposal, then. I want to know where to look.
Got it. Understood. We haven't decided that yet, so I can just put it in the kube deploy repository since we're already working there.
Yeah, and I think getting just a long-form discussion on that is better than trying to hash it out in 5 or 10 minutes here.
Okay. Any suggestions on how to kick that off? Do we want to open an issue? Do we want to kick off an email thread?
I guess I vote issue.
Okay. Issue with Doc. I think Google Doc might be a good starting point. Okay.
Okay.
Proposal issue to be open in the kube deploy repository. Attach a doc with the proposal, and this should cover the scope of the new repo and what shouldn't be transferred. Okay. That looks good to me. Any more thoughts there? Okay, I think Robert might be trying to log in, so if he kicks me off of the Zoom account, we'll restart it as soon as we can.
I think that it shouldn't kick you off if you're recording.
Okay, yeah, we're good. That's cool. I didn't realize we could.
Zoom doesn't give me an option to like switch accounts before I jump into the middle of the meeting, which is really annoying.
Yeah. Just to catch you up real quick, Robert, we were just having a discussion about the new repository, and we're going to open up an issue in the kube deploy issue log with a proposal for the scope of what should be in the new repo and what should and shouldn't move. And I think the goal there was to have a bit of a concurrent long wave discussion instead of trying to hash it out here. Cool.
That sounds great. Are you taking the action item to open that issue?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Let me assign myself now. Cool. The next thing I wanted to bring up was I have transferred over the Kubicorn API into the cluster API definition in the kube deploy repository. Most of the work was internally to the project, and switching things out or changing field types should be a relatively trivial amount of work at this point. So the fact that the API is not stable isn't really going to cause too many problems. But just wanted to kind of get it in there so that we can start using it and start to develop opinions about what is and isn't working for us. If anybody wants to look at my approach or talk more about it, I'm happy to share. The TLDR is that I pretty much nested everything in provider config, both for machine sets and for the control plane cluster definition itself. We'll start moving directives up into the higher level API as needed and as the project matures.
That's awesome. I also noticed it looked like you moved to a new org for the project too.
Yep.
Talk about that a little bit as part of the update.
Yeah, that was part of the update as well. One of the inspirations for that was we are going to start writing different controllers that will be reading from the cluster API, and having an organization where we can start to track those in different repos made sense. So Kubicorn will play the role of the bootstrapping mechanism, similar to Jessica's proposal, and then we will have small controllers that vendor the Kubicorn library to do things like autoscale the cluster. Cool. So that's my update there. And yeah, if anybody has any questions or wants to look at my approach, feel free to let me know. Next up, Chris, machine controller code structure and possibly breaking the auto-gen code.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring this up really quick. One of the things I want to do, at least for the Google implementation of the controller, is start like giving it a config map for generally how it should operate, and maybe making it more configurable. And like looking through this exercise, I noticed how the code is architected. Constructing a machine controller does not allow very much customization of it as you construct it. And one of the really bad things I think we have right now is that the actuators are linked into the machine controller library directly. And I would like to change that so that you actually, when you construct a new machine controller, you pass in an actuator you want it to implement. That way, at a top level, I could import, at the top level, like package main, I could import a Google machine actuator and pass it into the library. Or someone could import a AWS machine actuator and pass that into the library without the library itself being directly dependent upon anything related to Google or AWS. And the problem with this is the auto-generated code assumes that you can construct the machine controller in a certain way. And to make this change, I would have to break the auto-generated code. And I was wondering if, as a group, we're okay with that.
What kind of breaking are you talking about?
Specifically, there's some code in the package/controller that constructs a machine controller or assumes there's a certain way you can construct one.
Yes.
And then there's also in the machine controller itself, in the like ZZ underscore API register or whatever. It's a weird file name for package control, but it also doesn't allow the new machine controller is the constructor for it. It's auto-generated, so I'd want to add parameters to that to pass in an actuator.
So if this auto-generated, I need to look at what file are you talking about. But if this auto-generated file is only one-time thing, I think it's fine to change. But if this every time we modify a field or add in a field in the API, the code needs to be regenerated. If this file will be touched, then I think it could be putting a lot of trouble if you break them.
This is generated every time you add a new top level type. You get a new controller. So there's a machine controller, a machine set controller, and a cluster controller. I would only be breaking, I think, the machine controller.
I know, but so if we like add in a field or modify a field in the machine API in the basically machine type, so we need to rerun the code generation. Will this like touch any file you mentioned?
If you add a field, I don't think so. If you're trying to upgrade from like if you're trying to upgrade from the like 1.8 to 1.9 or 1.9 to 1.10 version of the builder, you would have to regenerate these files, and then you'd have to go back and manually make this change again. Because I think the APIs change from 1.8 to 1.9.
Yeah, I think that eventually we have to do that, right? With the toolchain, we gotta be like, I think along the way we'll upgrade from 1.8 to 1.9, and so
maybe it's better if I just go ahead and make the change and you can see what I'm doing. But I think the auto-generated code that we're being forced to deliver right now is also not that good of a design anyway.
Yeah, let's talk this offline.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll just handle this offline. If you want to send a link to like some of the relevant files in the chat, that'd be useful.
Craig had a question in chat about wondering how this overlaps with the cloud provider extraction, and I was going to kind of ask a similar question, which is if we are passing actuators in and we're trying to make sort of a generic machine controller, does that mean that these actuators are implementing sort of a quote cloud provider API, and we're back to trying to define a cloud provider API that works consistently across environments versus creating machine controllers that are sort of more specific to the environment they're in, which is where the cloud provider extraction effort is headed?
As far as like the cloud provider API, from what I've read, they're more. Sorry, I'm thinking of this currently in terms of like the external cloud controller for the API server, and they're more focused about just monitoring machine status to know if a node's not coming back, creating actual load balancers, and I forget the other two things. Oh, doing routes and stuff like that. So there is some overlap, but where our abstraction is currently at a higher level of where we're just saying add a machine, and anything that's required underneath that to happen, it probably has a lot of overlap. But at the level of abstraction, I think we're at a higher level than the cloud provider.
Well, to expand upon that question a little bit more, though, is I think some of the other work that's happening to extract cloud providers is to enable broader support for clouds that are not quote unquote in tree. So DigitalOcean being one of them, et cetera. Are we locking ourselves in by having to compile in the actuators into the code itself?
What? Oh, I see what you're saying. What I'm saying is right now we are locked in that way, and what I'm suggesting is trying to get us out of that by allowing people to have a top-level main of where they construct their own actuator from their own library, and then pass it into our controller library, like new controller, here's the actuator I want you to use, and then controller.run, like a 3-line main for each cloud provider, being able to reuse our cloud provider library, but pass in their own actuator. Right now, the actuators are compiled in, and they're constructed based on a configuration, like a global variable in a package, and I don't like that myself.
Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying, and I think that makes sense. I think we probably have to dig in to see exactly how it's implemented. But the more we can extract this and like enable other cloud providers or people to just walk up and implement their own actuator would be better, in my opinion.
I'll put together a straw man and then link it in the Slack channel. It won't be complete, but it'll show the idea behind it.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think at a high level, it's definitely easy to swap in a separate machine controller. I think what Chris is talking about is saying, okay, so now you want to build a new machine controller for something that's out of tree, like say DigitalOcean. How much work is that? And if we can make sort of the core controller part that does a lot of the watching the API and sort of notifying your code that a machine should be created or deleted or updated, reusable generic code, and all you have to do is write the actual glue to DigitalOcean, pass that actuator into the common controller, then that reduces a lot of the effort you need to do to write that. You can still write the whole custom controller yourself if you want to, but we'd like to be able to provide some common libraries to make it easier for people.
Yep, sounds good.
But even the actuator right now, if you follow this model, we basically just re-implementing like since like the Terraform. You basically the actuator is actually sort of like another implementation of Terraform. Because you want to make it practical, right?
Well, so Terraform could be considered an actuator, right? I think what Chris is saying is the actuator interface is maybe simple enough if it's just sort of create, read, update, delete. It's like if it's a simple sort of CRUD interface to the underlying cloud platform.
Sure.
Which is basically the abstraction that Terraform has, right? Terraform's plugins for cloud providers basically do just have a CRUD interface. I think things like Bosch have a similar interface in their CPI as well. So that's a pretty sort of standard standard way to address this.
Sounds good.
Okay, so I think the action there though is that Chris Rousey is going to maybe send out a short doc or some code pointers to talk about how this would sort of work in practice to make it clear to everybody what the value of this changes. Sound good, Chris?
This Chris or the other Chris?
Yep. This Chris.
The Chris has in the action item too.
I play this joke on him all the time too.
Okay. Anything else on the actuator separation discussion? Awesome. Looks like we have another one on the list. Update and Next API server migration. I think this is about moving the code over to the new directory.
Yeah. So yeah, I'd like to give an update on this topic. As of yesterday, I think I delete all the CRD-based code. So now everything we only have one version, which is Extend API server. So for the next step, I will try to rename Extend API server to just to class API. So is any objection for that? Because the current name is just a little bit of confusion for what's the purpose under this directory. So I would just rename to cluster API.
Okay. I think renaming to cluster API is good. I did have a quick question about the migration though.
Yes.
Has the types.go changed from the old directory to the new directory, or was it just a one-to-one port?
Not one-to-one. It's the old directory is just one very big type file. Now it's for every resource type a different type file.
Okay. Okay. I'm fine with a rename. I vendored in the code from the wrong directory into Kubernetes anyway, so I'm gonna have to change it no matter what. So might as well.
Yeah, thank you.
And then I think this will play a little bit into the migration proposal that I'll be working on as well, which is once we have that renamed, I have a feeling a large portion of that will be in scope to possibly be moved to the new repo.
Sure.
Cool. Anything else on that or in general?
One question on that, I think I asked this yesterday and I wasn't quite clear on the answer. So inside X API server, we have GCP deployer. Would this become something more generic than GCP specific?
I think the GCP deployer is implementation. Is that right?
It appears to be just a tool for adding and manipulating clusters and machines.
So it just mutates.
Yeah, GCP deploy just I think a tool mostly for demo purpose. So how this can using cluster API to deploy cluster on GCP specifically. So there's a potential to add other support for other on the other platform like AWS or other platform, but I think the longer term plan is maybe another new tool using Jessica's proposal to provide a different option like in cluster, out cluster, so different configuration how to deploy this. Right? So.
Yeah. So to restate that, the machine controller for GCP is under the Cloud Google directory, and there's a place there for Cloud Azure, Cloud AWS, Cloud DigitalOcean, any of those machine controllers we want to be in tree. And the GCP deployer is sort of the prototype bootstrapping tool so that we can actually test and play with the cluster API on GCP. And so I think the plan would be to basically, like I guess as Feng said, replace that with the proposal that Jessica came up with for how to bootstrap clusters.
So basically, for now, you can use that tool to just play with the class API. That's all its purpose.
Okay. Any other thoughts there? Any other thoughts in general? Going once. It's going to be a short call. Going twice. Okay, thanks for joining, everybody.
Thanks for running the meeting, Chris.